is a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi. She is the symbol of hope and democracy in Burma. She is also a widely recognized human rights defender. But would anyone want to take a guess as to how long she's been under house arrest? Maybe 5 years, 10 years? She's actually been under house arrest for 15 years, which for all of us sitting in this room, with the exception of Donna, the amount of time we've spent in school since kindergarten. The scary thing is, in the story of human rights defenders, most people would tell you that Aung San Suu Kyi is the lucky one. In 1988, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected president in the first democratic elections in Burma. Unfortunately, immediately afterwards, there was a military overthrow, and during the process of the coup, the military killed 300 pro-democracy demonstrators. The world really never knew. Myanmar, as its official name, or Burma, as the people like to call it, I'm going to use it as a case study for the successes and failures of human rights defenders and the methods for protecting them across the world. Although these methods vary, most fail to a certain degree. The 300 people are dead. I think they fail because of an inherent paradox that I have found. In order to save some people, you have to violate their human rights. In order to protect the larger society, some people have to suffer. But before I get into the why the paradox exists, I wanted to take you quickly through how all of the protection methods work. I've organized them into a schematic of 3, 2, 1. There are 3 strategies that deal with 2 larger issues that all get at one root theory. These 3 strategies are international protective accompaniment, media, and policy. So the first strategy, international protective accompaniment, is more or less an unarmed volunteer bodyguard who travels along with the threatened activist. This is a simplified diagram from Liam Mahoney, one of the world's premier experts on international protective accompaniment. And basically, as you can see, there's a commander who gives sort of an order to a perpetrator, but he uses sort of a smokescreen and says, "Wasn't me, I didn't do it." And then the perpetrator performs the threat or the violence on the targeted activist. The idea is that putting an accompaniment on the ground blocks both of those. It's pretty straightforward. So the 2 issues that are at stake here are the scale of the strategy and what I like to call the activation threshold, which is sort of how much action does it take to get each one of these strategies off the ground. So in this case, it's a pretty small personal scale. It's literally person to person. There is a person on the ground. And it has a pretty low activation threshold because it only takes 1 person on the ground to get this thing going. I'm going to save the root theory for later because I think the next strategy, media-based campaigns, explains it better. So there's a wide range of techniques you can use for media-based campaigns. Their goal is basically just to raise global awareness through media, like TV, news, and internet. Basically just widely disseminating the information as far as possible, because the more the world sees, the more the world has the opportunity to condemn whatever violation has been reported. One example of this human rights violation that's reported by the media is the letter writing campaigns sponsored annually by Amnesty International. This is actually how I first heard about Aung San Suu Kyi. This is the letter writing campaign for my senior year of high school in which she was featured. The idea is that the volume of letters sent to the government shows the world is watching. A second type of sort of media-based action would be more like this. This is a still from the video Burma VJ, which stands for video journalist. In this movie, the video journalist captured the protests in 2007 as they were occurring and smuggled the footage out to world news. The idea was that this would both empower the protesters and restrict the government from cracking down on them like they cracked down on the 1988 protests. So media works on a very large impersonal scale. As you can imagine, this is this giant media organization and global governments working. It's not really person to person like the last one was. But it does create a bad public image. To this extent, to create the bad public image, it takes a very high activation threshold. If you think about what captures the media's attention these days, it tends to be very dramatic, very violent, and to keep and hold the media's attention, you really need the shock factor. So why does public image of a bad behaving state matter? It gets at our root theory. So the root theory, as far as I have been able to determine, is something along the lines of social contract theory. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, contractionarianism, which is the more formal term for social contract theory, is the political theory of authority that claims that legitimate authority of the government must derive from the consent of the governed. Basically, there's a consent, this consent is a contract between the government and the governed that says it won't violate your human rights, for example. And the media works because when they show in an international stage that this government has violated the contract with their people, it creates bad credibility for them on an international stage. It makes it hard for them to function in the international system. Speaking of the system, that brings us to our third strategy, which is policy, in particular the United Nations. The United Nations strives to form the human rights norms on which the world is based on, through mechanisms such as monitoring countries' compliance, writing and publishing reports on that compliance, and then issuing statements that either praise or condemn these states. There's not really much enforcement involved in that, as we all know. So why does it work? Well, first, it establishes an explicit social contract theory between the states, and the UN works between that consent between the UN and the state governments themselves. Breaking the set norms there means that a country is sort of breaking with the contract and breaking from the international system. It also sets the political and legal foundations for NGOs to work. Most of the NGOs do the work on the ground that the UN is too broad an organization to do. And then as a last resort, the UN can do economic sanctions to disrupt government function and also prevent violence by peacekeeping troops. This is our Burmese example of the UN at work. This is the UN Special Envoy meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi. Shortly after this visit, actually, there was enough international pressure that many Myanmar political prisoners were freed. But again, the UN is a very large, impersonal scale. It's a huge organization, and by that same token, it's a really high activation threshold. Stuff has to be pretty dire for action to get going, especially if you want peacekeeping troops on the ground or economic sanctions. So where does my research fit in all of this? I wanted to look at how all of these systems play into each other. They have a very synergistic relationship. If you look, the media needs the policies to work, the policy needs the NGOs to function, the NGOs need both to actually get their work off the ground. But there are some problems with large-scale methods, and that's a lot of what I found when I was doing my research. Nobody's really talking about stuff that doesn't work, because if an NGO is criticizing itself, it's probably not going to get funding. And the UN is kind of notorious for really not being able to criticize itself. So the basic problem that I found with the large-scale methods is that because there is this global stage and this global power, it needs that horror factor, that shock, to jar people out of their own worlds and get any kind of action going. So this leads me to what I like to call the paradox of protection, what I mentioned earlier. So to get this horror factor, to get the action going, get them off the ground, you need to violate some human rights. You need, you need to get, the way the system is set up, there needs to be a violation, there needs to be some suffering in order to save other people from suffering. So if there's that paradox with the large scale, why not just do everything on a personal scale? Well, it's pretty hard to scale these things up. There are thousands and thousands of human rights defenders on the ground who are threatened, and we physically can't put a person next to all of them. But also, as I mentioned before in that synergistic relationship, the NGOs who are doing the international protective accompaniment need the media and the policy basis to function. So we're kind of stuck with the system we have, as far as I can tell. I would love to say that there's some sort of middle ground, but I'm still working on formulating what I think that middle ground would look like. For now, I have a quote from the Burma video journalist who said that effectively the overarching human rights change that he was trying to create in Burma was worth the danger and the sacrifice by his colleagues, because more lives were ultimately saved and more lives were fundamentally changed if Burma became a more democratic place. The question is really, which one do you value more? Do we value every human rights defender right to live, right to live in freedom, unharmed and not threatened? Or do we value the greater good, that the work that they are standing for? So I want to leave you with this image. These are the hands of a little actor working on a little stage, a very small personal one. What he or her holds in their hands is the fight for a bigger change on a big stage against a big government. The question is, which are you going to choose, little or big?